Okay, so I'm going to have a look at language paper 2, question 2. Two main things with the language paper. It's not actually that difficult. What they're asking you to do is skills that you're able to do. The sources are generally nice, they're well selected, they compare really easily. The two main things that we need to be completely kind of confident on going in is what the examiner is expecting me to do. So the question doesn't always immediately make it super clear what it is they're looking for you to do. And then secondly, you need to be really conscious of your timing. So this is the difficulty in the language papers. I think both of them stems from how long you're given to do the things that you've been asked to do. So really for this question, I'd probably be aiming for 2 paragraphs, but more importantly, I'm writing for 15 minutes. So I'm going to write as much as I can write in 15 minutes that will answer this question. If I realise that I've only written a paragraph in the 15 minutes, that's absolutely fine, because more important than anything else is keeping track of my timing and making sure that I know I'm not running over massively and ending up with only sort of 20 minutes to do my 40-mark question 5. So I've got a really specific way that I would advise you to approach the reading section on this paper. So I'd start off with question 1. It's a super simple question. You are going to be given 8 statements. 4 of them will be true and 4 of them will be untrue, and you just decide which it is. I would approach that first. It's easy, it gets me going, feeling confident, aiming to get 4 out of 4 on that question. Then I'll move on to question 3, not question 2. Now that's because question 3 is going to focus on a single source, just as question 1 does, and often it's the same source, so it makes sense to do those 2 together before I need to bring in the other source. Then I'm going to move on to question 2. Question 2 is going to be the first point where I'm being asked to compare between the 2 sources, and it's going to have quite a narrow focus. So this is a good sort of way to warm up for the idea of comparison. And then lastly, my final comparison question is question 4, which is a bit of a bigger question, and it makes sense to approach that last when I've already spent some time thinking about the 2 sources in some detail. I'm going to focus now on question 2 and how to approach that question. Okay, so here's an example of what the question might look like. You need to refer to source A and source B for this question. So like I say, question 2 is the first point where they're going to ask me to look at both sources, and I'm ideally going to approach this as the 3rd question. The children at the primary school and the ragged school behave very differently, so you need to make sure that you read that question closely to make sure that you're writing about the correct things. This is often a fairly narrow focus, and you can find yourself writing about something completely incorrect and not getting the marks for it, so make sure you're confident on what it is. And for this one, it's about the behaviour of the children at the 2 schools. Use details from both sources to write a summary of what you learned about the differences between the behaviour of the children at the 2 schools. So remember, I'm in that behaviour of children is the focus, and this question asks me to look for differences, but it might ask for similarities. Ultimately, your examiner will reward either similarities or differences. They are not that bothered about which you're doing, just as long as you are making a comparison. It tells me to write a summary of what I learned, but actually there aren't any marks for just writing a summary. This is AQA being a little bit sneaky, and you just need to be 100% sure on what it is they're asking you to do, and actually what they're asking you to do is make inferences. So a good place to start would be, what is an inference? So an inference is an assumption that you make about something you see, read or experience. It isn't just a thing that you do in this exam, it's a thing that you'd have been doing for the vast majority of your life, where you make educated guesses about all the information that you have at a particular point in time. You'll have been doing this with books since you were very, very young, and the only sort of challenge is to realise that you're doing it, because you'll do it naturally all the time. Okay, so here's some examples of inferences that you'll make on a daily basis. So if your teacher's teaching you and they stop and they write something on the board, you might infer that they want you to write that down yourself, or that that's a particularly important bit of information, more important than other things they've been saying, and that's an inference you could make. If a child ran into the house and they were holding their knee and they were crying, you could infer that they'd probably fallen over and that's how they'd hurt their knee. Now, none of those things are you being told explicitly, but they're obvious inferences for you to make. Now, you'll have not seen the 2 extracts before, so it's possible that you'll make inferences that aren't correct. However, as long as it's rooted in the text and it's valid and the examiner can understand how you've got there, they'll be wanting to reward you for that. So it is an educated guess, but sometimes you get it wrong, and as long as it's logical, that's absolutely fine. Okay, key thing. It's just as important to know what it isn't as it is to know what this question is. So it's not a how question. It's not about the writer's use of language or structure. It's not about the effect on the reader. It's not about language. It's not about the writer's viewpoints or perspectives. So we're not looking for you to say the simile whatever or the adjective this. We're not looking for you to say the writer is trying to make the reader feel. We're not looking for any of those kind of things. We are just looking for you to make inferences and to make comparisons based on the things that you're being asked to write about. Okay, so here's an example. It would be useful if you've seen this before, but it's not the end of the world if you haven't. So it's taken from a modern text. It's about a school inspector who's been visiting several schools, and he goes to visit this one particular school in an area of deprivation. So there's lots of factories and sort of poverty around the school, and then he goes in the school kind of expecting it to be a bit rubbish, and it's brilliant and it's really well managed by this head teacher who's really in control. And one of the lines that we can find from that source is that the school is compared to a hive of activity. So I would pick that quote and I'd be thinking, okay, what do I know about hives? So I know that they include lots of bees. So this is a school with lots of children in, that they're very ordered, that they are very efficient, and that suggests that this school is really successful and that the children's behaviour is excellent. And I could also talk about the fact that in a hive everybody's got their own job, and it just creates this sense that this school is really high functioning and really effective. Okay, so I've taken that quote, a hive of activity, and I've interpreted those things about the behaviour of the children because that's the focus of my question. Okay, so I need to try and select a quote that I can compare this to in the second source. And in the second source, we've got a 19th century diary of a school teacher who works at a ragged school, so a free school that everybody's allowed to go to, which was relatively new at the time. So school up till now was something that you paid for, and this is a free school, and has got lots of poor children that attend these schools, and he's finding their behaviour to be really unruly and difficult. And we've got this quote: the lanes leading to the school were full of men, women and children, shouting, gossiping, swearing and laughing. So, okay, what can I interpret? I can interpret from that the children might not be in the right mind frame for learning because there's so much sort of fun and activity that's going on the way to school, so that their behaviour when they do get to school might not be brilliant. I could also interpret that through the swearing, that potentially these children might not be brilliantly well behaved because we might not assume that children are going to be swearing. So I've taken one quote from source A where I've talked about the children's behaviour, and then I've found another quote from source B where I can talk about their behaviour as well. Okay, so once I've selected my quotes and I've thought about the inferences that I'm going to make on those quotes, I need to write it up. Now, we've got this really catchy, memorable way that we write it up, and it's called SQICSQI paragraphs. It's really catchy and memorable, SQICSQI, and easy to say as well, so that's great. But all it is I'm making a statement, make a point about what I've learned from source A, use my quote, inference. Ideally, I'm going to make more than one inference, but I'm just going to do the best I can with that quote. Then I'm going to use a connective or a comparative word to link to my other source. I'm going to make my statement about it, what I've learned about that source, use my quote, make my inference or inferences on that one. Catchy, memorable, easy to say, winning all round. Okay, so here's an example of a SQICSQI paragraph. It's easy to say. Based on those two quotes that we've just looked at. So in source A, the school is presented as a calm and orderly place. So there's my statement about source A, as it is described as a hive of activity. So there's my quote. So I've got my statement about source A, which tells me what I've learned from the quote, and the quote that I've kind of selected that information from. Hives are well organised places, which makes the school seem like it's an efficient and effective school. Additionally, in hives, every bee has a different job, and when the school is compared to one, it makes it seem like a united place with everyone working to get towards ensuring the students get the best education possible. Right, so those are inferences I've made from the quote hive of activity. It's not there explicitly. It's also not me saying the noun hive or any of those kind of things. I'm just using that language to make an educated guess about the student's behaviour. Okay, so I've got my statement, my quote and my inference. Then I'm going to make my comparison using that connective. So for this one I've gone for however, but you might be saying similarly, likewise, additionally, that sort of thing. So however, in source B, the approach to the school seems disorderly and chaotic. Now that's a statement about source B, but it's also a bit of a comparison because I said in source A that it was calm and orderly, and here I'm saying it's disorderly and chaotic. The writer describes the lanes as full of people who are shouting, gossiping, swearing and laughing. So there's my quote. This makes it seem like the people approaching the school are loud and unfocused, and this makes it seem like the students won't have a focused attitude towards their study and are likely to be more interested in socialising than studying. The fact that many of the people are swearing might also suggest that they will be poorly behaved in the school. Okay, so there's my inferences on that second quote. Now if I'm feeling really comfortable with this question, I've put this extra sentence at the end. This heavily contrasts with the ordered and calm behaviour in source A. So I've made another comparison. Now that's only if I'm feeling really comfortable with this structure and the sources I've got, but if I can do that cross-referencing throughout the rest of the paragraph, that's going to gain me extra marks as well. Okay, so there's an example of that catchy SQICSQI structure being written up. Okay. Final thing to remember, not a big deal at all, but is something that sort of might niggle at your examiner. So the reader infers, that's us interpreting the information, but a writer implies. They can't infer just as a reader can't imply. So that's the last thing to remember if you can.